My parents were Catholic when I was very young, but they left the Catholic Church when I was 7, and they left over the issue of birth control. They had 4 children, and that's all the children they wanted. And the church said that if they used birth control, they would not be allowed to take communion. So they simply left. My mother always was of the opinion that there is no God, but if there is a God, it's the Catholic God because the Catholic faith is the one true faith. And as I was reflecting on some of the questions I was told you would ask, I started thinking about the fact that, yeah, I think the reason that my parents went from Catholicism and did not explore any other possible Christian faiths was because they had been ingrained with the idea that Catholicism is the one true faith. So if you don't believe in that, then you have no faith. And I think that Christians made the same mistake with me, although not over that issue, over a different issue, and the different issue being biblical inerrancy. Um, for the most part, I was raised either agnostic or my dad, I guess my dad was probably more of a deist. My mom was pretty close to an atheist. She didn't believe that there was a hell. She didn't believe that there was a God. But like I said, she still believed that if there was a God, it would have been the Catholic God. Um, I always had some kind of religious inkling just from that early childhood. My grandfather was deeply religious, and anytime you were around Grandpa, which was my mother's father, the Catholic Church had a huge role in it. He gave me this book called 14 Saints for Girls, which I read, and I decided that I wanted to be a saint. I was probably about 12, 13 at the time that I read that book. And I started doing some rather disturbing things that I don't know that you're going to want me to go into detail on, to try to prove my devotion to God. But I lost interest in that, set that aside, and no longer really, I didn't really have any kind of belief in God until I was a sophomore in high school. As a sophomore in high school, I was starting to think about what life was all about, as teens are wont to do, and was drifting toward nihilism. I could not find a purpose to life and any reason to exist. And so I started planning my own suicide, but I didn't tell anyone about it. Um, I had an English class where we were seated alphabetically, and the I Found It movement that was in the 70s was going on. And the guy that was seated in front of me became a Christian as a result of that movement. He was very on fire, wanted to share his faith. So I was the target because my name happened to come right after his alphabetically. And we would come into class and he would take all my books away so that I couldn't study and ignore him. And he said, "You're going to sit there and you're going to listen to me." And so I listened to him. He knew very little about Christianity. In fact, he told me that um, in the Garden of Eden, that after Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel, because Cain killed Abel, Adam had died, so Eve had to have sex with Cain in order to produce any more offspring. Or was it Seth? I forget. But anyway, yeah, I don't know where he came up with that idea. But he said one thing that was very powerful to me, which was he told me that I needed a purpose in life, which I definitely felt like I did. I'd been exploring that idea for some time. And he told me that um, that I would I don't remember exactly what it was. That was a long, long time ago. Was it 45 years ago, 50 years ago? Um, but basically he somehow knew that I was depressed and would and needed God. And I had not told anyone about my plans for suicide. And so I felt like God had given him some kind of insight. And I felt like he had something. So I decided, he knew that he didn't know a whole lot about Christianity. So then he introduced me to one of his friends who knew a little bit more, and they went through one of the Four Spiritual Laws tracks with me, and they didn't even ask me to pray. They gave it to me and told me to go home and think about it, which I did, and I then prayed and I accepted Christ and prayed the sinner's prayer, agreed with everything that was in the booklet. And became completely immersed into this new life. And I really felt like something had happened. When I got up the next morning, I felt happier, I felt lighter, I felt like something had changed. Um and so I really felt like I had God in my life, and I started going to church, but going to church was difficult at that point. I was 16, I didn't have a driver's license. Um, and there wasn't a church within walking distance of my house. So there was a family that used to pick me up for church sometimes, a friend of mine from school, not the same one that led me to Christ, a different friend. But they had 6 people in their family, and their family filled up a whole pew, so I couldn't sit with them. And so I always sat by myself, and I always felt like an outsider and a loner. I never really felt like I fit in until I got to college. When I started in college, I was absolutely thrilled because my parents were concerned about my delving so deeply into religion so quickly. And they didn't try to stop me, but they did say, one church service is enough a week. You don't need church service and Bible study. You don't need youth group. You don't, one church service enough is a week. A week is enough. So when I got to college and I could do anything I wanted, I joined 5 different Bible studies. I went to Campus Bible Study, Campus Crusade, Navigators. I don't even remember, but I had a different Bible study every night of the week. Um, but that became unsustainable. I I needed to study too, and I couldn't go to Bible study all the time, so I cut it back to 2, and eventually back to 1. Um, got into an evangelical free church. I had been attending an evangelical free church in my hometown um, before I had come to college. That's more of a northern United States thing. It stems from some countries in Europe. You pay taxes to the church, but the church has to preach whatever doctrine the church the state subscribes to. So a free church is a church that does not accept government money and can preach whatever they want to. And transplants from Europe over to the United States, they kept the name Free Church, even though none of the churches here obviously get money from the government. I did have a fear in college that I kind of wonder about now, that I feared that I would quit believing. I feared that something would take me away from my religious faith. And I talked about that with my campus crusade leader, and she said, "Oh, don't worry about it. If you ever start faltering in your faith, I'll be right there." Um, I met the man that I eventually married, and I'm still married to. I
That's
actually
wonderful.
wasn't. Excuse me?
I said that's wonderful. That's
Yeah, we've been
fantastic.
married for 42 years.
Awesome.
Um, we have always gone to church, although one thing interesting is early in our marriage, when I was telling my husband, okay, now I want to get involved in choir, I want to do women's Bible study. We go to church on Sunday night, we go to church on Wednesday night. And my husband was, wait. Can't we just be pew sitters? And no, no, this is everything. We need to do everything. And so I was the one that was driving the train. I was the one that made us go to every church function that there was. And now that I am no longer a believer, he still is a believer, but I think he is happier in his faith now because now he can just be a pew sitter. And because of COVID, he started watching church service online. And so now the extent of his religious activity is Sunday morning, he goes in the bedroom with his computer, watches a church service, and after an hour and a half, then, okay, I'm done with that for the week. 1984 is the year that everything almost fell apart, but it didn't. 1984 was the worst year of my life. I was
Hmm.
pregnant with my first child. My husband's my husband was active duty Army. His was up in Fort Hood, Texas. He was sent to Fort Knox. He had two different schools he was to go to, each one being 6 months, so that we were supposed to be there for 1 year. And then we didn't know where we were going after that. I was 7 months pregnant when we arrived in Fort Knox, and the baby was stillborn. Um, the medical care I received at Ireland Army Hospital was horrendous. The doctor felt it was best for me to carry this baby, even though it was dead, until I went into labor naturally. And I had been carrying the baby dead for 3 weeks,
Oh goodness.
and something happened, and I wasn't sure what it was. And I went into the hospital, and they weren't sure what it was either. And I said, "Do you think maybe my water broke?" And they said, "Yeah, yeah, that could be it. Go home." And I went home, and had been having some contractions before my water broke. And I know now, I figured out later that, yeah, that's definitely what happened, was that my water broke. Um, but they quit. And when I called and told them that, I had been having contractions, but they quit, they told me to go ahead and come in, and they would induce me the rest of the way. So first of all, I carried a dead fetus for 3 weeks. They left me with having my water broken, susceptible to infection. And then I come back in, and I was the only patient. And I was trying to get the baby out before midnight. And one of the nurses looked at the doctor and said, "Why does she want the baby out before midnight?" And the doctor looked at the nurse and she said, "Because after midnight, it's Mother's Day."
Hmm.
I did not succeed. She was born 10 minutes after midnight. So
Hmm.
on Mother's Day in 1984, I gave birth to a stillborn child.
Wow.
The medical care continued to be horrendous. My IV ran dry, and I was bleeding into my IV, even though I was the only patient on it, in the ward. So there was really no excuse for the medical care that I received.
Yeah, that's awful.
Having only been in Fort Knox for a couple of months, I didn't know anybody, so I had no support system other than my parents.
Mm-hmm.
My parents had been kind of driving me crazy because my mom was a NICU nurse,
Hmm.
and she knew that me carrying that baby dead was extremely dangerous to my health. And she would been trying to get me to convince my doctor that this was not the right thing to do. And I
Mm-hmm.
did. I did tell my doctor that. The doctor stormed out of the room, and I never saw him again.
Hmm.
Um, So anyway, that was that. I picked up a book called What to Do When, let's see, Where is God When Life Hurts?
Mm-hmm.
And I clung to that book.
Hmm.
And I really examined my faith at that point. And I said, is God real? And I boiled my faith down to the bedrock. And
Mm-hmm.
to me, the bedrock was biblical inerrancy. And I said, as long as the Bible is inerrant, I know that it has to be the word of God. And if this is the word of God, then I will follow it no matter what. Somehow there has to be something that's right about the situation. Somehow God will make it right. And I will trust in that. And I did. I had two children, one in 1987 and one in 1989. When they got to be about uh, 8 and 10 or so, I started getting really depressed and became suicidal again.
Hmm.
And I clung to the idea that I know God doesn't want me to kill myself. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
God wanted me to go to heaven, I'd go to heaven. And so I know that's not what he wants. But it was driving me crazy.
Hmm.
I kept praying and praying that he would take it away, and he didn't. And it was at the point where, I'd be driving down the road and I'd see a telephone line and I'd say, oh, if that fell down, it could electrocute me. I would hear a train whistle. I'd think, oh, I could drive in front of a train and get killed. Yeah, everything to me was a way to die. Death, I became absolutely obsessed with death. And it was extremely difficult. And the thing that was the most frustrating was that my faith did not help. I went to my pastor. I went to a Christian counselor. Not he was a licensed counselor. He had a master's degree in counseling, and he did help me. He got me to the point where I was no longer obsessed with death, and I would no longer was actively trying to die. But he didn't do that good. Anytime I attended a funeral, I was still jealous of the person that was dead because I wanted so much to be with God. And life in heaven is supposed to be so much better. So why? Why am I even here? So okay, obviously God has some kind of purpose for me. I need to just keep on plugging. And so I did. Around that time, I also was really dissatisfied with my marriage. And a big part of that was that there was no connection with my husband. He worked 12 hours a day. And when he got home, he'd have dinner, he'd sit down at the computer, he'd play computer games until he was ready to go to bed. There was no interaction at all. And a few more, by this time the kids were 10 and 12, and I said a few more years and the kids are going to start going off to college, and I'm going to be sitting there looking at his back for the rest of my life. So I decided I wanted another baby, and so we did. We had a third child quite late. I was 40 when my youngest was born. Best decision I ever made. My youngest child is the one that I am the closest to, and absolutely adore him. Okay, fast forward another 18 years. When my youngest child was a senior in high school, now I sent all of three of my kids to private Christian schools. I want to make sure that they were well ingrained in their Christian education. When my youngest was a senior in high school, I could see that his faith was faltering. And he made the comment that he was worried about getting kicked out of school for not believing anymore. And so he tried to keep his lack of belief to himself. And I knew that that was an issue too. And I remember going to his graduation, and as soon as graduation was over, they didn't actually give them the diplomas at graduation. We had to go the next day to the school and pick up the diplomas. I don't know why. But we did. But once I had the diploma in hand, I said, good. Now you can admit you don't believe anymore. We have the diploma in hand.
You're free.
Yep. It was about 2 months after that, that my faith completely vanished, and it was my son had a part to play in it. But the big major crack that came to my faith was when I reasoned my way into the divine hiddenness problem. And I didn't even know that that's what I had done. I had been an atheist for 2 years before I described what happened to me, and a philosopher said, oh, that's the divine hiddenness problem. But what happened was I was reflecting on the life of the Apostle Paul. Now, because my husband had been active duty Army, I've gone to a lot of different churches. When we were in Texas, we usually went to Baptist churches. I had a friend that convinced me that Calvinism was a more biblical Christianity. So we spent a decade in a Calvinist church. When we moved from Fort Wayne, Indiana to Huntsville, Alabama, where I live now, we started going to a Baptist church, but I always look for churches that were more reformed minded, although we went to a couple of Presbyterian churches down here as well. But I was reflecting on it, and for the first time in my life, I started thinking about what Reformed theology means to the unbeliever, and even what Arminian theology means to the unbeliever. And I was reflecting on the life of the Apostle Paul, and I was thinking, God made a personal appearance to Paul. Why? Well, obviously, because God wanted him. God had a use for him. He was going to be, who he came to be, and God wanted him. And, well, doesn't God want everybody? The Bible claims that God wants everybody. Is God able to do that for everybody? Come and make a personal appearance, or it wouldn't even have to be a personal appearance. God's omniscient. He knows exactly what everybody needs to know in order to come to belief. So if God knows what everyone needs to know in order to believe, why wouldn't God just give that to them? That question I could not answer. Um, and so I kind of pivoted at that point to universalism. And I kind of came up with my own theology, which was that after people die, that if they weren't already a believer, that God would just lay everything on the line and explain everything and say, okay, now that you have a full understanding of who I am and what I'm all about, you choose. Do you want to follow me or not? And so that was the point I came to. But about that time, it was about 2 weeks after that I came to that point that my son told me, Mom, Noah's flood didn't happen. I said, what do you mean Noah's flood didn't happen? Well, for one thing, the poop on the boat would have killed them all. And I knew a little bit about pig farming. And I knew that if you have a barn full of pigs and you close the barn up, the pigs will die because the methane gas will kill them. You have to have sufficient ventilation. And I thought, if that's true of pig farming, I would think that would be true of an ark that's completely stuffed with animals too. And so I started looking it up online, and yep, I found a couple different articles that both said that Noah's Ark is physically impossible because of the poop problem. But the poop problem was only the tip of the iceberg. My son then showed me a video of an ark protest, and Aron Ra was at that ark protest. And he was talking to a man, and he said, not only do we know that Noah's Ark couldn't happen, we know that it didn't happen. And we know that from biology, geology, history. And when he said the word history, that was the end of my faith. That was the moment that it all shattered. And the reason is because when he said the word history, I realized that not only did Noah's Ark not only did it not happen, but I had always known that it didn't happen. When I say always, I mean since high school, since I had studied ancient history. And I knew enough of ancient Chinese history to know that there isn't this period of time where the historians say, okay, and then the entire civilization died. There was nobody in the entire country for, 300 years. And then people started migrating into China, but these were a completely separate people group, and we see from their pottery and their art style that they came from Babylon because they were Babylonians that came from the Tower of Babel. That's not history. And I'd always known that that is not history. And so when he said that, I realized, yeah, the proof is there. The ark didn't happen. And that was the end of biblical inerrancy. And biblical inerrancy was the foundation of my faith. And with no foundation, there was no more faith.
That is quite a story, Kelly. I can relate to you on several levels. I lost my father when I was in high school to suicide. And I myself, for as long as I've known, before I was a Christian and even after I've become a Christian, I still struggle with depression. The suicide ideation has long since passed. I've had counseling as you have. But the depression doesn't go away, and I've wanted God to lift that from me. It would be nice to see life through the eyes of not having melancholy swarming around you like a fog. So I can relate to that. I can relate to what you said about, where is God in these struggles. And it's certainly not an easy question or one to take lightly. And it's a good reminder, Kelly, I think, to appreciate your story, because oftentimes when we're talking about Christians and atheists, we look past the human story that you've just told, whatever side we're on, and we just want to get into the transmission arguments, if you will, just the exchange of information, the passing back and forth of facts, like we're playing pickleball with facts, and we don't get into the reasons, the personal reasons or the personal stories, and we don't get personal with one another in a meaningful way. I think there's a lot of back and forth in the Atheist Christians discussions where it's the impersonal nature of it makes it difficult to have meaningful and trustworthy dialogue. So, but I appreciate everything you say, and I've wrestled with a lot of these difficulties myself. So you began your Aron's comment just solidified for you.
Aron's comment connected to, I have a tendency to think in compartmentalized way. And
Okay.
my religion folder and my secular history folder, I had never thought of putting them together. And what Aron did was he built the bridge between those two areas of knowledge
Okay.
that I already had.
All right. And that was when you talk about the Ark protest, you're talking about the Ken Ham Creation Museum in Kentucky, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Why don't we begin in the beginning? You did, I think it was last year sometime, you did a little vignette, a video vignette for your oldest grandson. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. And he asked you if God didn't create the universe, where did the universe come from? Now, that's a pretty profound question for a grandchild. How young was he when he asked
was
you this
8.
question? Wow. So is he still a Christian today, or?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
He has never seen the video.
He hasn't.
His
Mom and
mother
Dad don't
will
want him
not
to
allow
see
it.
it.
His mother won't allow it.
I understand that. But it was a good breakdown. I think you put your cards on the table. You said what you thought was wrong with the text, and you were very straightforward with it. And I think an 8-year-old could certainly understand that. But you said in the video at the time you couldn't answer him, and so I guess he asked you the question. You felt inadequate to be able to explain it. Did a little research, or what happened?
No,
What was
it was
the
a
story?
time constraint.
Okay.
We were on our way out the door somewhere, and there just wasn't time.
Okay. And so you start off with Genesis, and this is funny. This is the only Hebrew I remember from seminary. Barashit barat Elohim et hashamayim va'et ha'eretz. Do you know what that is in Hebrew? I probably killed the pronunciation.
I know Elohim is one of the names for God.
Yeah. So that's Genesis 1:1.
Okay.
Yeah, in the Hebrew, because my Hebrew professor at the time, that's all we would say. We would recite that every morning, so that's been drilled into me. But so when you talk about the text and the variations in the text and the difficulties in the text, what is it initially? And some of our viewers will link this video so everybody can watch the video in its entirety. But here we'll just maybe talk a little bit more clarity about things. What is an initial problem for you as an atheist with the text of Genesis? In specifically, we're talking about creation. You list some issues. What's the number one issue for you in terms of Genesis 1 and 2? Because I think that's all you covered in the video was just those 2 chapters, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that the biggest problem is the special creation of man.
Okay. And for you, I would watch the video today. I've watched it a couple times. Your issue with the creation of man is, does it come before or after plants, right?
No, the issue is that evolution is quite well established, and the fact of humans having evolved from other primates is demonstrable. And so, if there was a literal Adam and Eve, were they created alongside the humans that evolved? If they were, this creates a huge theological problem, because all of the people that lived before Adam and Eve would all be sinless people. Either that, or the Bible's wrong about Adam, sin entering the world through Adam. no matter what view you pick of trying to mesh a special creation with what we know of evolution, theologically, something in the Bible is going to end up being wrong.
Okay. So, from an evolutionary perspective, if I'm hearing what you're saying correctly, you're saying that whether or not you have an evolutionary creationary view, like some do, some hold to
Right.
hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution and then Adam and Eve, or whether it's the first two human beings, genetically, on an evolutionary or natural selection scale, the creation story of Adam and Eve has problems in whatever direction that you perceive it to be. Is that your...
Yes.
That's the first one. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I understand that. From a natural selection point of view, Kelly, how do you understand, and I'm asking this because it seems to be a variety of different opinions, and I'm not talking about abiogenesis necessarily, but in the continuum of human evolution from a purely naturalistic standpoint, in your understanding, was there a first Homo sapien? And if so, how did that come about as you understand it?
I would not say that you certainly could not point to one and say, that's it, that's the one. And are you familiar at all with Erica Gutsick-Gibbon?
Yes.
Okay.
I've watched several of her videos
Okay.
before. It's been a while, but I know who she is, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. She is a doctoral student in primatology. And a great deal of what I know of human evolution comes from watching her.
Okay.
And she has explained a lot of where the gray areas are in trying to determine which species are genus Homo and which species are not. And she explains how characteristics of other great apes have evolved, which characteristics they are, and how the teeth are different. And this particular species has the teeth of a Homo genus, but it does not have maybe the brain case size of something that would be in genus Homo. And one of the things that I got from her was a list of a number of different species, and these species were presented to a number of creationists and were asked, are these ape or are these human? And the creationists do not agree. And that's to be expected because the scientists don't agree. That there is not a clear delineation of these are genus Homo and these are not. We have drawn a line. We have said, these are the ones that we accept as genus Homo and these are not. But I don't think you can say, okay, this one gave birth to the first genus Homo species ever.
Okay. Fair enough. I am not a biology or science expert. My expertise, well, I wouldn't even call it expertise. My interest is cosmology and astronomy,
cool.
and I do a podcast on that, so that's where my interest lies. But I do love the discussions about biology and natural selection.
I did get into one issue with creation that is a cosmological cosmology,
we could
is the
talk
light
about that a
problem.
little bit. Yes, yeah, the light. Let's talk about that a little bit because you do talk about the biblical
I had an interview
account.
with a cosmologist. Well, actually, he's not a cosmologist. He's actually an expert in lasers, but he does have a lot of interest in cosmology.
And that's on your channel.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you would, you can link that to me, and I will send me a text with that, and I'll put it in the description of our video chat that we're having. Here's an interesting thing. This past week, I just did a book club. I just led a book club discussion with my atheist friends at our Dallas book club, and we talked about the beginning with light, and the question came up, Kelly, about how photons could have been produced without electrons, because traditionally, as I understand it, quantum mechanics says that a photon is emitted when an electron drops down in energy level within an atom. And so I think maybe this is one of those chicken egg questions, is that how do we have photons before we have atoms and particles and electrons? And had you thought about that question before? I don't particularly have an answer. There may be one. I don't know. But have you thought about
No,
that particular?
I have not.
Okay. So you did talk. Let's talk about the light in the Bible, because you
Okay.
raised this question. There's light for the first 3 days. And I think you say in the video, that's
There's
weird.
no sun or moon. Yeah.
There's no sun or moon. And in addition to that, God is saying, here's evening and morning the first day. And you're like, well, how can we have evening and morning without at least the sun?
Right.
And that's a question that comes up a lot. And it's a good question. And the other issue that makes this more difficult, Kelly, as you know, is that how do we have plants and some animals without the sun, moon,
Right.
moon, and stars? So is that still have you heard other Christian alternatives for why this is? Have you heard any apologetic explanations?
For the young earthers, they say it's not a problem because the sun was created the next day. The plants were only in the dark for 24 hours.
Okay.
But I also do not take young earthers seriously. I think young earthers are about on the same level as a flat earther.
Oh, okay.
Are you a young earther?
I have a position. I'll just be flat out honest. I think the universe is much younger than what science tells us, but I don't have the science brain, and I'm not trying to avoid controversy. I don't get specific about an actual age. And the only reason is because I find the Bible doesn't give us a specific cosmic chronology, if you will, or of the earth or of the universe. And for time that we don't have, and maybe we could talk about it during the book club, there are reasons within modern cosmology that make me question how old or how big the universe is. And that's just based on my knowledge, my limited knowledge of cosmological models. So I am comfortably in between, because I have Christian friends that are definitely old universe, and I have a lot of good Christian friends that are young universe. And it's an in-house debate that sometimes gets a little acrimonious, as you know. And a lot of atheists like to exploit that debate, and I completely get it. But I'm not one of those who would take a genealogical chronology from the scriptures and apply it to a Bishop Usher-like age of 6,722 years, or whatever the specificity is. I don't do that. But I do think the universe, more than I think it's younger, I would say it was younger, I would say that we probably don't know as well as we do.
Well, you do recognize that there are stars that are millions of light years away, correct?
Yes. The basic issue for me, Kelly, is currently the three different ways of measuring the cosmic microwave background radiation, which you briefly mentioned in the video. There are three distinct ways since 2010, I think, or in the last 10 years. Between 1965 and 1995, Alan Sandage and Wendy Friedman were going back and forth with age measurement problems. And Sandage would say 10 million years and Friedman would say 20. I don't know exactly. I don't want to pin the numbers to their camps. But for 30 years, there was a great fluctuation between, how old do we think everything is. And right now, the debate, some are calling it a crisis in cosmology, is the Hubble constant and how they're measuring it. So there's three different ways to measure the Hubble constant. Cosmic microwave background radiation, polarized light, the arrangement of the background radiation from 380,000 years after the Big Bang. And then you have what Wendy Friedman does now is red giant star luminosity, and she looks at those. And then there's one that Adam Seiss, who won the Nobel Prize in the 90s for discovering the universe is accelerating. Adam Seiss came up with a measurement using Cepheid variables and type 1a supernova, and he got a different measurement. So the cosmic microwave gives you 67 kilometers per second per megaparsec. Wendy Friedman's red stars gives you 69.8, and Adam's Cepheid and type 1 supernova give you 74 kilometers per second per megaparsec. And when you get into the meat and potatoes of the debate, it's as tense and as difficult as it was 30, 40 years ago, because Is it the measurements? Is the universe telling us something? So along those lines and many other reasons I could give, I think the way we measure our universe, the expansion and the size of it, to me, there's a lot of unknowns, especially with dark matter and dark energy.
But wouldn't you say that it is well settled, though, from the fact that we can even see stars that are millions of light years away, that the Earth has to be at least a few million years old?
Well, there's one thing that I think, and again, I'm not a cosmologist here, but in Einstein in 1905.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said that was your field.
I'm a layperson. It is my interest,
It's
but
your
I'm
interest.
not a doctorate. I'm not a doctored
Okay.
scientist in it.
Okay.
Sorry if I didn't make that clear, but in 1905, I think it was 1905, Einstein's paper, he assumed that light, the 186,282 miles per second that we know of, can only be measured in one direction. So in other words, you can postulate that light travels that fast, but you're assuming a round trip speed. And really all we can measure is the one-way speed. And Einstein just says, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that light travels the same speed in both directions, but there's no way to test that. I'm just going
That's
to assume.
exactly the topic that I have with Matt Almost a Doctor on the interview on my channel.
Okay.
This is the exact topic that we.
Yeah, and it's not to say that Einstein. I'm not saying Einstein's wrong. I'm just saying that you couple this with dark energy, Kelly. So dark energy is what's essentially accelerating the expansion rate of the universe to the extent that galaxies that are further away from us, some of them are moving faster than the speed of light itself. So. And a cosmologist will tell you that it's not the galaxies moving that fast, that it's space-time fabric, like you have in your video, stretchy balloon skin. So space-time fabric is invisible, stretchy balloon skin. And whatever dark energy is accelerating galaxies at the far reaches of what we can see, faster than the speed of light. So there's two mysterious conundrums there. One, if the universe is expanding faster than the speed of light, well, that's breaking Einstein's cardinal assumption. That's Einsteinian inerrancy, Kelly, that he's just, what we might call Einsteinian cosmological inerrancy. You can't break that law. But apparently, according to what we're seeing, it is being broken. And the other thing is, the other dynamic of dark energy is that it doesn't interact with anything else that we know. We haven't detected a quantum field for it. We haven't detected a particle for it. And yet, this is what a majority of the universe, dark matter and dark energy, are made of. Dark energy comprises most of the universe, and it's unknown. Nobody can test it or see it. We are only inferring it from the redshifts, the way we measure distances. So, for me, there's a lot of inferential ladders, and I'm not saying by that they're all wrong. I'm just saying that the more I read into like ultimate explanations for whatever it is, I always see it in the basement, Kelly, dark matter or dark energy being invoked to some degree, but there is so much that is unknown about those two things that I find that it's hard for me to accept it as a ubiquitous explanation for why things are the way they are, because they're always in an equation somewhere affecting some aspect of the universe. So that's my hesitation in embracing the full-on Big Bang cosmology.
Okay.
So with your Genesis interpretation, let's talk about the light and the stars. From a Christian, so you've only heard the young Earth pushback on that, right? You haven't heard any other.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Specifically, that interview, he was explaining a paper to me that was too technical for me.
Okay.
That was talking about a theory that similar to what you alluded to, but didn't fully explain. That there is the possibility that life travels at the speed of light in one direction, but instantaneously in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can't measure that, but that's an idea. That's what Einstein assumed. But it's still, even if that's the case, Kelly, to be candid, I mean, it still works, right? The equation still works. Do we know what would happen if it was actually different? We can't measure it, so here we are. But there's a good video on that I've seen, but I don't know a whole lot about what difference it would make if that was different. So let me throw something out, and then you can see what you think about this. in 1 John 1:5, we read that John's saying that God is light. And so this is Dan's. I think this is classical. This is a classical argument. I don't know how prevalent it is, but many of the theologians that I've read and the commentaries I've read about this say that the light at the beginning is not created, because the word bara is not associated with that first light as it is with the sun, moon, and stars in day 4. So this is something of an enigmatic light, but what does it do? It's sufficient for sustaining the life that follows thereafter. So my take is that this is God himself, the light that sustains life. In John's opening of his gospel, John 1:5 and 6, in him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shined in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. So in the ancient Near East, I know you've studied ancient Near Eastern mythology and history, you alluded to that. What God is doing in Genesis is saying, the lights in the sky don't give life. I give life. I'm the only one that gives life. The lights in the sky in Genesis are for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. They govern the day and the night, but they don't give life like God does. In the ancient Near Eastern mythologies and cosmogonies and cosmologies, the lights in the sky were divinities that were life-giving divinities. And Genesis turns that bucket on its head and says, no, God is light, and he is the only light that gives life. That's how I understand those texts. What do you think of that?
Then when God said, let there be light, had he not been light before and suddenly he became light?
I think you say this in your video, and I'm glad you make the point. There's a lot before Genesis 1:1 that had to happen, or that we come into it in situo. In other words, in the middle of the story, in media res, right? So we're coming into the story midway through, like we're like an action movie Hollywood trailer. So I think what God is saying is actually messianic, and talking about in a prophetic sense, God allowing light to come into the world that he has created, God permitting, God orchestrating, God ordaining the light, his light, to come into the world, and that ultimately is pointing to Christ, who is, John 8:12, the light of the world in a metaphorical sense. So God is saying, here I come, let there be light, let me come down, as John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh, the Logos became flesh, and dwelt among us. Let there be light. That's how I read it prophetically.
Okay. I've always understood that to be Jesus.
Yes.
Okay, the light. So in the beginning, when God is creating, God says, let there be light. So you're saying that isn't God creating anything. God didn't make anything at that point. He was just declaring a prophecy that one day he would be sending Jesus?
In a sense that he is allowing his light to come into the world that he is creating. And that is fantastically, I think that points to Christ, who does come into the world ultimately with us and dwells with us as human beings. So again, like I said, if you look at the text in the Hebrew in Genesis 1:3, where it says, and God said, let there be light, the Hebrew word for create, bara, is not there. So there's something else is going on there. And I think this is God's light. Because in the book of Revelation, you read at the end, in the new heavens and the new earth and in the new Jerusalem, there's no night, there's no sun, there's no moon, there's no stars, because Jesus is the Lamb who is the lamp, as Revelation calls him. So he illumines the new creation, just as he did, I believe, and just as he did, because in Proverbs it talks about wisdom, which I think is also a personification of who Christ is, talking about being at God's right hand in the creation of the world. So I think you have something of a messianic reference to that very verse, right off of Genesis 1:3. You're talking about Jesus.
So is it your position that the world existed, but God had nothing to do with it? And when he said, let there be light, that God then established a relationship between himself and the world, but the world was godless until he did that?
No, I think, as you said in your video, I would agree with you that the earth was tohu and bohu, formless and void, and waters covered it, and then God separated the waters. So there was something there. How that got there, Kelly, I think he created it, but I don't think we have the details of that. Now you point out that this is exactly backwards from current modern understanding of how the universe came into being and evolved, because the Earth allegedly is only 4.5 billion years old. So how can it be the first on the scene before stars, sun, and moon, which, according to modern models, tell us it's exactly the opposite, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that God created this situation, this planet that was formless and void. But we don't see that prior to Genesis 1:1. We're just told in a summary statement, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. We don't get the technical details of his workshop, if you will, before. What does this formless void thing look like? Is it a lump of clay sitting on a potter's wheel? Has he got a little tinkerings like Santa's workshop? What's going on? We don't know. So I will grant you that. But I will say that I think that God created that too, because that's what Genesis 1:1 says. It's kind of a summation of what God did. So that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Okay.
But had you ever heard that before?
Not specifically, but I've heard so many different theories and variations that it certainly doesn't surprise me.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm glad I was not a surprise to you. That's that's good. I don't like to surprise people too much. Well, let's talk about, you do bring up the oftentimes cited contradiction. I think it's between Genesis 1:12 and then Genesis 2:5-8, where you have Genesis 1:2 or 1:12, I think it is, where you have the plants. It says the herb grass in the Hebrew. It's herb grass, and then you have fruit trees coming into. Those are the specific things mentioned in the Hebrew language there in Genesis 1:12. When you get to 2, you get it looks like it's saying that before there was anything in the fields, God created a man. So it looks like a contradiction. And that is your understanding presently, textually, right? That you think that's a contradiction?
I don't think it's a contradiction per se, and here's why.
Okay.
I think there are multiple authors to Genesis, and somebody or a group of people edited taking different stories and putting them together. And it's not a contradiction, it's just two different people's versions of what happened. It's just two different creation accounts.
Okay. And that's how you presently see it, is just
yes.
being a collection of redacted stories and tales. So you follow the documentary hypothesis, yes?
Yes.
Okay. And in your understanding of the documentary hypothesis, then, what you're saying is that Genesis 2 is Bob's version of creation, and Genesis 1 is Tom's version of creation.
Yes.
In your mind, in that thesis, Kelly, how do you reconcile why these two things, if they were so different, were left side by side without further redaction or explanation? Like, why wouldn't somebody wanted to smooth out something that looks contrary? Why do you think they just kind of left them there? What's your thoughts on that?
I think that whoever put them together wanted to keep them as much original as possible. I think they weren't trying to rewrite the story, but rather trying to put the story together.
Okay. I was going to mention that the Genesis 2 account actually mentions a couple of things. Textually in the Hebrew, it says that before there was any herb of the field and any herb plant of the field. And then it further says, because there was no man to cultivate the ground. And those two things, the herb of the field and the plant of the field, or the shrub of the field, are things that require cultivation. So you might, in a colloquial sense, Kelly, read the Genesis 2 account of those things as there was no farm yet, because there was no farmer. In other words, those specific kinds of plants that are mentioned require human cultivation, or were understood within the Hebrew culture to require man working the ground. Thus the emphasis on grass of the field, plant of the field. This would have been agriculture as we know it. And so traditionally, I think theologians have said, well, Adam was to cultivate the ground. You know that the plants that shoot up, God says later that you will work the ground by the sweat of your brow. So what Genesis 2 is saying, basically, before there was sin, before there was a fall, before there was a man, before there were plants in the field that we had to work on, this is what happened before the creation of the world. So that's one account that I've heard about that. Any thoughts on that? And then we can. Okay. So
one way to think of it.
It is. You have a law background, I understand. James and Bill tell me that you were a trial lawyer, civil attorney. What was your?
I was an insurance attorney.
Okay, so you've been in court and you've presented evidence, right?
No, I worked
No.
for the insurance company and I dealt with, I worked for Brotherhood Mutual, who is it's a company that insures churches. And we would handle their liability. But because we sold insurance in 20 different states, 25 different states, whenever we would have something go to court, we would have to hire local counsel to take it to
Gotcha.
court.
Gotcha.
So
Because
I was handling things in many different states, and
okay.
my expertise was workers' compensation.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, with given your law, but now you have a law degree to get that, or
Hmm.
was that okay? Okay, so you have a law degree, so you have an extensive background in the legal proceedings and stuff like that. I just talked to J. Warner Wallace a couple of weeks ago. I just interviewed him for his new book coming out, and we talked about his line of work as a police officer and court cases and things like that. One thing that comes up in our book club all the time, Kelly, is the problem of evil. You kind of alluded to it earlier with divine hiddenness. So this is kind of a twofold question, and you can go wherever you'd like to with it. Number one, as a non-believer now, what is your position on evil? Is it real? Is it something just we make up? Is there a real
Oh, it's
objective?
definitely real. I'm
Okay.
also a CASA volunteer, and I definitely see evil.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're talking about objective moral evil.
I don't know whether it's objective. I can't answer that question.
Okay. Okay. You don't know if it's just something evolutionary in our specific time or if it's universal throughout human history. That's kind
Correct.
of you're kind of agnostic
I
on that
don't.
question.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Where now? I don't know where you fall because I hadn't seen you talk about this before, but this also comes up in our book club quite a bit. Kind of ties in with the problem of evil is God and the what I'd call the moral monster objection, the kinds of things that he did, allegedly that he did in the Old Testament. Let's just call them, for colloquial purposes, crimes against humanity, Kelly. Let's say God is in the dock of a human court and you're the presiding prosecuting attorney. He's been found guilty of all these charges and lump whatever you want into there. What, Kelly, in your estimation, would be an appropriate sentence for an individual like that? What would you give him?
An eternity of community service.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting response.
I mean, since he's omniscient and omnipotent, and that's supposed to be what he's allegedly doing anyway.
An eternity of community service. Now, you mean it in a retributive or a corrective sense? Like is he supposed to learn from this, or is he just being punished? With
No,
no
it's
hope of
supposed to be, he's supposed to learn from this, learn
okay,
how to be a servant and how to do good in the world instead of doing evil.
gotcha. But this should last forever. No parole, right?
Why not? I mean,
Okay,
he's
okay,
timeless. It's only going to take a second for him.
gotcha.
But seriously, this is one of my criticisms of the alleged God, is that he seems to have a serious lack of problem solving skills, and that his answer to everything is kill it, kill it. You know, if you transgress, kill it. And I don't get how an omniscient being can't say, let's look at rehabilitation.
That's an interesting point. Do you see the cross of Jesus as purely retributive, or do you think that has some that offers grace to people who want to be rehabilitated?
Okay, I have to separate two different ideas here. What
Okay,
I actually think of the cross, I think Jesus was found guilty of being a criminal and he was crucified. Whether he really was a criminal or not, I don't know.
okay,
But the political powers that be were threatened by him, and so they crucified him. And that's really how I see the cross. He was simply
gotcha.
someone that threaten the powers that be, and so they put him to death.
Okay.
I realize that's not how Christians see him. I realize that they see that something more was going on there, and they believe that it was voluntary. But if Jesus' death was in fact voluntary, then I have no sympathy for him whatsoever, because this is what he wanted to do. He chose this. There is nothing in theology or in the Bible that said that the sacrifice had to be a painful sacrifice. There's nothing that says that Jesus had to suffer. So, if he chose to suffer, he chose to suffer.
Yeah, I think when he's going to the cross or carrying his cross, people are weeping for him, and he says, "Do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves."
Right.
So he's not asking the cross. He's not asking for the cross to be a source of "oh pity me."
Mm-hmm.
He's asking it to be. He tells Christians to bear your cross, to die daily. You're right, Kelly, in one sense that, as I told Jay Warner, he was talking about a rookie mistake he made as a detective, where he crossed some police tape and ended up stepping in the blood of the murder victim. And his higher ups had ribbed him, just couldn't let him live it down. And one of them says, "What, do they teach you to stand in the blood in homicide school, Jim?" And it was just one of those red-faced, embarrassing moments that he never forgot. But you could, and I told Jim in the interview, I said, that comment, Jim, reminded me of Christianity, in the sense that you could consider it to be some kind of homicide school where we learn to stand in the blood of Jesus for the forgiveness of our sins. He's like, "Yeah, I didn't see it that way when when I made that mistake." but yeah, there is a death at the centerpiece of our faith. So you accept the cross as historical, and but you don't see it as Christians see it, but you accept that event and the crucifixion of that person as historical.
I'm fairly certain. I'm not 100%
Okay.
certain, but I'm fairly certain that the crucifixion was historical, yes.
Gotcha. You look like you wanted to add something just a minute ago.
I did. Now I can't remember what it was.
Just raise your hand and come back to it if you can think of it.
Okay.
We both struggle with depression, and we both have been through it. You've ended up on the opposite side of the God question. Of course, we have Kelly. Let's say that. Let's say you're right. Let's say Christianity isn't true. What somebody watches your videos, or like you, has this moment of an epiphany of sorts that connects bridges and connects disparate things, like you see Aron Ra in Kentucky shouting at Ken Ham or whatever he was doing. I don't remember. I haven't watched the video, but you have this epiphany. You have this moment of realization where everything crystallizes, and you realize everything I believed is not true, or it's a lie, or something like that. Kelly, what would be your advice? And I know you're not speaking for all atheists, and I'm not even saying that all atheists think the same, or I'm not even thinking that all atheists define atheism the same way. But for you, Kelly, what do you tell someone? So somebody like me, who, if I gave up my faith in a year or two or something like that, what advice do you give me? What do I do now?
That is the slogan of my channel, which is live your life. And, I spent so much of my life trying to think, okay, what does God want of me right now? What can I do to advance the kingdom of God? What can I do to make God happy with me? And now I'm just live my life.
So that basically, does that mean like whatever you feel like you want to do, kind of thing?
To a certain degree. I mean, I do think you obviously there's need for self-restraint. You don't do whatever whatever thought pops into your head, but I think you do need to consider what would best advance humanity. But an epiphany that I had not too long after I deconverted was when I was at the grocery store and I was standing in the cookie aisle. And for the first time in my life, I said, what do I want? And that was just such a strange thought to me, because I had been so taught that it's God first, my husband second, my children third, and I am last. And I'd never gone to the grocery store and thought about, what do I want? And it was a life-changing thing to be able to start thinking about myself for the first time.
Have you heard the pun? What's the loneliest aisle in the grocery store?
No, I have not.
The exile.
Ah.
Some people are like, wait, what? Oh, yeah. The eggs aisle. Actually, in my grocery store where I go, there's hardly anybody at the eggs aisle because they're remodeling the store. So the eggs are moving. Eggs are constantly moving. Everybody's wondering where the eggs are.
My biggest problem at the grocery store now is they recently redid the shelves so they're one shelf higher.
Oh, no.
I'm
Oh, no.
5'1". I couldn't reach the fourth shelf, and now there's a fifth shelf.
Oh, my gosh. That's so inconvenient. I'm sorry, Kelly. That's terrible. That is awful. That is awful. I go to the grocery store, I get overwhelmed by choices because I'm single. I've never had anybody under my care. I've never had kids or a wife or anything. So when I go to the grocery store, it's overwhelming to me to make the choice that your epiphany is my misery. What am I going to, what am I going to make for dinner tonight? I'm the only one who can answer that question. So, but yeah, we're overwhelmed with choices today, aren't we? It seems we really are. It can be overwhelming at times. Kelly, it's been a delight to spend this hour with you and to get to know you and to hear your story. I hope and pray that we give you a human side at the book club. We always try to respect our interlocutors, be they atheists or Christians or whatever. I have the utmost respect for people who have been in both camps. I love listening and hearing their stories. I'm friends with a lot of non-believers and skeptics, and have really appreciated your candor and your time. Final thoughts.
One thing that came up in the last book club, people ask me, why do I do this? Why would I ever want to talk someone out of their faith? And the answer is the same reason that you try to talk people into it, is I care about people. And I don't want to see people doing what I did, which is wasting so much time and money and effort on a God that doesn't exist.
Kelly, is there anything that people who do YouTube or social media, is there any way that you see from your perspective of how we can improve this kind of dialogue? Or do you think it needs improvement?
I think the big thing is exactly what you're doing, is being willing to have the dialogue in the first place.